debate. The issue is the future of the social taxonomy. So the further development of the work of the European Commission around taxonomies. We started with the environmental adaptation and mitigation taxonomies. Now we're moving towards social elements, which in the context of COVID, I think is particularly important. And we also want to focus a little bit on the role a social taxonomy can play, or elements of a social taxonomy can play in supply chains, notably around human rights.
Here we can see that the due diligence legislation indeed cannot separate between ES and I hope also not for G. It seems to be now the case that in the crisis, in the COVID-19 crisis, those companies that are already assessing their risks and possible adverse impacts on environment and human rights, they are weathering this crisis better, because they have this awareness of their operating environment and they are ready to respond to different challenges.
Climate change, and I really want to highlight this, even as obvious as it might sound, is first and foremost a social problem. The second point I would like to make and to stress is that the current green taxonomy ensures really high social standards. It's a very important point to understand the complexity when looking at social aspects. It's because the taxonomy operates at activity level, not at company level. It's a very important principle that needs to apply whether we talk about a green taxonomy or a social taxonomy, which is the principle of proportionality. The platform that has a mandate of 2 years does not have an obligation of developing that taxonomy, but it's more about publishing a report describing, giving the recommendations to the Commission of whether or not it should develop it and what are more or less the basics, the framework that should taxonomy have. And then, as I said, is to give a little bit of clarity around the minimum standards and about how to conduct. For me, it's about the due diligence, what it will be covered, what are the expectations on the minimum standards for the green taxonomy.
What we've seen is that there's obviously quite a few, challenges for investors in really fulfilling this responsibility. So we've also observed that expectations upon investors to respect human rights have increased dramatically in the last few years. And these expectations come from beneficiaries, from employees, from NGOs, civil society, and the broader society in general. And what we've observed with the COVID crisis is obviously that there is an urgency for investors to play their part so that social issues really come to the fore and that human rights are respected. And the goal is to have PRI signatories respect human rights, but the broader investment community as well. And one way to do that is that we're going to increase accountability of our signatories by introducing in our reporting framework some questions around human rights. So really getting investors to report as to how they're implementing those due diligence processes, etc. And then also with our policy work, promoting policy measures that enable investors to take these steps and to fulfill their responsibility.
Which basically brings me to one key point, which is that here what we're talking about is it's not so much the fact that you might be investing in a company that in the supply chain might be violating human rights. It is about what sort of processes you put in place to identify that that's happening. And once you have identified it, what do you do about it?
And for me, it's an illustrative example of several issues that the industry is facing. I think the first one is the huge risk of only relying on self-disclosed data, because often the company won't know what's happening. And as Elena said, now you have in many cases, so many companies and such a long supply chain that they just don't know what's happening. At the moment, the way I see things happening is a more reactive process. Companies and investors may react to an NGO report, to a newspaper report, but there is not that much being done from a risk mitigation perspective. What can be done proactively? and concretely tracing international supply chains with the intent of mitigating human rights risks is still an open question and a major challenge in the industry, given the scale of the exercise and the peculiarities of each sector.
The quality of the due diligence process is key for preventing, mitigating, managing, and at the end of the day, remedying for shortcomings and failures in the supply chain vis-a-vis human rights, labor rights, but also the environment. What we need is a level playing field where the front runners reap the profits rather than the backbenchers who do not want to act responsibly. We shouldn't rely too much on self-auditing, and that's clearly an issue. No big hedge fund can go and run after 40,000 companies. There needs to be some sort of reliable, verifiable audits then.
How would that fit into some more government-driven or public policy-driven mandated framework? And how could such a framework learn from the work that you've done so far?
Regulation really help us enabling investors to fulfill their duty as responsible investors. Incentivize the front runners among the companies that do best is really crucial. And investors use their leverage to kind of get companies to do better. And one thing that I've often heard in conversation is really trying to tell companies that it's okay to have issues, and it's normal for the due diligence exercise to kind of shed light on issues in your supply chain, etc.
More and more stakeholders have been asking for standards. The rationale behind the mandatory due diligence and the social taxonomy is that they would harmonize the current patchwork and of requirements and increase legal certainty, which would ultimately level the playing field, which is much needed at the moment. And I do think that the EU legislative proposals have the opportunity to go further than existing standards and address existing gaps. And key existing gaps, in my experience, dealing with companies and investors is first, that at the moment we don't have enforcement mechanisms and accountability. So there is a great opportunity to go further on this. And secondly, that will be the integration of corruption with ESG and human rights matters.
I think what we are now doing and what you are doing has a chance to become a kind of a leadership, take the leadership in this area of respecting companies, respecting human rights, environment, and so it's a crucial moment, and we need more cross-fertilization to learn from one another.